Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Science Fiction Economics Lab. This is maiden voyage. My name is Alberto. I'm the research director of Edgeryders, which is kind of a organizing partner behind that. And my job is simply to do housekeeping. So very uninteresting, but still. So first thing that you need to know is that the lab doesn't end here. We have a pretty long journey in mind, and you can find the next steps starting already tomorrow for people who are interested in actually offering papers on a new economy that we would like to invent. So tomorrow we will be at ULB, at Solvay School of Economics. But before that, we have a party, which is tonight at La Tricoterie, starts at 9, and you're all invited. The other thing that I need to tell you is that we have shared note-taking online, and also we have a thread on an online forum where you can introduce yourselves to the other people in the Science Fiction Economics Lab. You're not all here. There is a very important online component which will be joining us through a live streaming and the chat, which is manned by Marina here. Marina, hi. So please switch off your phones, unless you want to take notes, but taking notes on your phone is not great. Okay, you want to take pictures, fair enough. You can take pictures, but please then in that case, go on airplane mode or something. And I guess that's all from my side. Let me introduce Kirsten Dunst, CEO of Climate-KIC, who is our MC. She will introduce her own work and why she's interested in the Science Fiction Economics Lab. And I hope we will all learn a lot in the maiden voyage. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Alberto. So my name is Kirsten Dunlop. Sorry, Alberto, but I thought I'd better say that just before. And no, don't worry. In the least, I'm also the one that's late, so I haven't started off the proceedings in a perfect sense. And actually, I've come from the European Parliament where the whole conversation was about science to policy. So it's a particularly interesting hyperlink, almost mental hyperlink into what we're here and what we're doing this evening. Because so much of the questions is, how is science and how is economic thinking that organizations like ours are supposed to be fomenting, supporting, enabling, giving us what we need to make the political and policy choices that we need? And of course the answer is it's not really much at the moment, or at least not fast enough. So that's part of why we're doing this and why we believe so passionately in the power of exploration at the edges of what we know and what's possible. I facilitate, run, lead, coordinate, have the privilege and enormous opportunity to work for an organization called Climate-KIC. The KIC in that stands for Knowledge Innovation Community. And this is very much what we are about, creating spaces for the exchange of ideas, of thoughts, of imagination, and of possibility, of exploring communities that explore the edge of the possible, and bring and make available the edge of the possible to decision makers, to those who need to make commitments to act. We are a large pan-European community and one that has existed for 10 years by the end of this year. So we also have a lot of experience and learning about what it means to take public money. We are predominantly funded by taxpayer money, and to direct that at innovation, with the objective of that innovation being directed at climate action, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, and the whole world of things that needs to happen there. And one of the things that we've reflected on over the last 2 years, asking ourselves, we're about to turn 10, what should our next 10 years bring, is how hard it is to learn from the edges, even when, or possibly especially when, you are supposed to be doing innovation. How easy it is to type into a center, to ossify, to find ways to see yourself in the things that you recognize, that you know, in the known, and begin to build up a set of directives and policies and programs and initiatives that are all about the comfortable self-reinforcing loop of the things you expect to see, even when you're doing innovation. And I would argue, especially when you're doing innovation, because you keep telling yourselves that it's innovative, so it's good. So one of the things we've really been challenging ourselves on is, if we're going to exist for the next 10 years, first of all, we need to understand our context. And our context is one in which there is radical discontinuous change. We need to think of ourselves in terms of relevance to that context, coherence with that context, and that requires us to be able to conceive of change and of innovation in relationship to change in the dimensions that is required, at the scale and the pace of whole-scale transformation of almost everything we know how to do, that we know how to live, and that we know how to believe in. So that's a very, very big ask. And when you start to say to yourself, we would have a license to operate only if we had that scale of ambition, then we need to start asking ourselves, well, how are we going to make sure that we are continuously testing our own assumptions on where innovation of that order might come from? And how do we find it, connect it to capital, connect it to policy, connect it to decision makers, and give it space to achieve the possible that is discontinuously different from what we've been doing for the last 150 years. That's why we're here. Because at the heart of the organization that we are sits a set of indicators of performance. And those indicators of performance are related to the concept of markets, of growth, of productivity, of jobs, of security, of competitiveness, of European relevance in a global context. They are solid, weighty, economic, social and political indicators, and they sit firmly in the grounds of the existing economic system, which gives us a small problem because we know that almost everything about the existing economic system is causing us some significant issues when it comes to climate change. And so if we are going to innovate effectively, we need to break the assumptions of the existing economic system. We need to find alternatives, generate options, generate different ways of thinking about value, about stocks, about flows, about time frames for exchange, about medium, long-term, real-term, embedded, synchronic, contextual value, things that our current economic system does not know how to account for, or if it does know how to account for, is not mainstreaming that capability into our existing ways of planning and thinking about economics. So we are particularly concerned at the same time that we support innovations in science, in technology solutions, in political change, in citizen enablement, in behavioral change, in logistics and supply chain design, in business model design, in financial systems innovation. We are particularly concerned to look for and find and build, ideally, the conversations around alternative ways of thinking about value, the exchange, the transfer, the ownership, the definition, and the relatedness of value between human beings and between human beings and their physical construct, their context. We need alternate narratives. We need them to come fast. We need them to be inspiring. We need them to have humans at the center, but we also need them to help humans think beyond themselves, because that's one of our biggest challenges. And we desperately need something that offsets the failure of imagination to give us alternatives. So we are investing deliberately in ways in which we can learn from the edges, the neoclassical economic edge, of what sits beyond the models that we work with, what sits beyond the KPIs and the indicators that we are asked to perform with. What is at the edges that we could learn from, that we could bring together and create a conversation around that would allow us to exercise imagination in the way in which we think about value, created, exchanged, stored, made, and felt. How could we learn from the communities that can help our conversations directly to the European Parliament or directly to the European Commission reframe what it is that we collectively focus upon. And we are here to learn from those whose professions are traversing boundaries of possibility through imagination, through storytelling, through narrative, and through bringing together hyperleaps into possibility and grounding them into parables, into vignettes, into the metaphors that have structured the way in which we think about so many things. We have metaphors for the way in which we think about artificial intelligence that have come from science fiction. We have metaphors for the way in which we think about social inclusion and social exclusion that come from science fiction. We have metaphors for the way in which we think about community, social mechanisms, structuring of identity, structuring of our relationship to time. It's about time we started to pull economics, kicking and screaming onto the stage, and said, how about we subject economics, the thing that we consider to have been almost outsourced from human agency, a force out there bigger than ourselves, that somehow has its own extrinsic life to which we are simply constantly toggling in a management relationship. How do we manage the market? How do we work on market forces that are bigger than us, that are beyond us? We made it. We designed it. We conceived of it. We made it. We dreamed of it. We wrote about it. We rationalized it. We institutionalized it. And we normalized it. And we believe somehow that it's out there beyond human agency. So this is our experiment, the first in a journey, of creating a stage for conversation and exchange. What if we took back human agency into the design of economics and thought about and pushed ourselves and imagined a set of possible alternatives? What about if we gave ourselves language and metaphors and ideas for the way in which we might think about value differently? And that might sound like a very kind of abstract thing in relationship to the problem of temperature rising and sea level rising and food running out and people starting to fight with each other, but it's not at all. If we can change the code that we are using to exchange food, to look after properties, to take care of each other, to share commons, to think about the way in which we exchange and define value, we can change, if we can change the operating principles, we can change so much more that's sitting up at a surface level that we are working on a daily basis. So we are interested in a conversation, catalyzing a conversation that is about the code, the underpinning assumptions, the operating theories, the models, the mental models we have for what value looks like. And with that, I would really love to welcome two extraordinary people onto stage who are going to provide the opening substance for that kind of exchange. What I will do is introduce them one by one. So I'm not going to introduce them both. I'll introduce one and then the other, but ask you both to come up on stage together in a minute. And one by one, you're going to hear from them. And these are, think of it as dialectic, as a way of exchanging ideas, of listening to different perspectives, some very similar, some different. And then we're going to hear from four people, three of whom are in the audience, one of whom is not, who are going to bridge and braid and build and add in other elements of perspective. And then really the time is up for you to add yours and to riff. If we're in an improvisation theatre, then this is the night for improvisation. To riff and build and exchange and imagine what can we make in the course of this evening that we as an organisation can use to drive our constant activity of science, exploration, innovation into policy. And what can you, as actors in the world in different ways, make use of in your own ways forward and keep meeting each other on different stages to build a thread, a meme, a set of new assumptions for how we wire the world. So with that, let me invite Cory Doctorow and Tom Bowler onto stage, please.
mic's on.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, so Cory Doctorow, welcome.
Thank you very much.
I've been reading, I enjoy reading your books. What I had not discovered was all of the other things. So I've been reading with avid interest in preparing for this and thinking, okay, this is a whole other world of lives, crafts, boundaries traversed, and meaning structured into things, which is a salutary reminder to me that my favorite authors, I need to go and actually check their history. That's the problem of having come through a deconstruction education. You were always taught to not go and look for the author. So Cory Doctorow is a world-famous science fiction author, allowing that space for you to claim or do something with, an expert in technology, an activist, and the director of a technology blog, Boing Boing. And what I would particularly want to bring into this conversation is the fascinating dialectic in your work between what technology is in service of, what it makes possible, why, and how one might reflect upon that in ways that are less linear than usual and not leap to the straight assumption. So, over to you.
Would you like me to do my talk, or is this a Q&A portion?
No, this is your talk.
This is the talk. All right, very good. All right, thank you. Thank you for that. Sorry, little ambiguity there. I've resolved it. We're good. Hi, folks. Thank you very much for having me. And I'm keenly aware, as I always am when I'm outside of the Anglosphere, that I was born one of the world's fast talkers. I was the scourge of the UN Simultaneous Translation Corps. When I would speak as slowly as I knew how and turn around, and there would be 5 booths with 5 translators all doing this. So I invite you all, you will not offend me, to just wave your arms when, not if, I speak too quickly. And thank you very much for having me. It's a genuine honor, and thank you for that lovely framing material there. So I thought what I would do is read briefly from this book, Walk Away, and then speak about what it means and give a little presentation on economics and science fiction. We'll hand it over to Tom, and how the rest of the evening goes. So the bit I'm going to read, it's from the second chapter. It's called You All Meet in a Tavern. Sundays at the Belt and Braces were the busiest, and there was always competition for the best jobs. The first person through the door hit the lights and checked the infographics. These were easy enough to read that anyone could make sense of them, even noobs, but Limpopo was no noob. She had more commits into the Belt and Braces firmware than anyone, an order of magnitude lead over the rest. It was technically in poor taste for her to count her commits, let alone keep a tally. In a gift economy, you gave without keeping score, because keeping score implied an expectation of reward. If you're expecting a reward, it's an investment, not a gift. In theory, Limpopo agreed, but in practice, it was so easy to keep score, and the leaderboard was so satisfying that she couldn't help herself. She wasn't proud of this, mostly, but this Sunday, first through the door of the Belt and Braces, alone in the big common room with its aligned rows of chairs and tables, all the infographics showing nominal, she felt proud. She patted the wall with a perverse and unacceptable proprietary air. She'd helped build the Belt and Braces, scavenging the Badlands for the parts its drone outriders had identified for its construction. It was the project she'd found her walk away with, the thing uppermost in her mind when she'd looked around the Badlands, set down her pack, emptied her pockets of anything worth stealing, put extra underwear in a bag, and walked out into the Niagara Escarpment, past the invisible line that separated civilization from no man's land, out of the world as it was, and into the world as it could be. The code base had originated with the UN High Commission on Refugees and had been field trialed a lot. You told it the kind of building you wanted, gave it a scavenging range, and it directed its drones to inventory anything nearby, scanning multiband, doing deep database scrapes against urban planning and building code sources to identify usable blocks for whatever you were making. This turned into a scavenger hunt inventory, and the refugees or aid workers, or in shameful incidents, the trafficked juvenile slaves, fanned out to retrieve the pieces the building needed to conjure itself into existence. These flowed onto the job site. The building tracked and configured them, a continuously refactored critical path for its build plan that factored in the skill of its workers or robots or on-site at any moment. The effect was something like magic and something like ritual humiliation. If you installed something wrong, the system tried to find a way to work around your stupid mistake. Failing that, the system buzzed your haptics with rising intensity. If you ignored that, it tried optical and even audible. And if you squelched that, it started telling the other humans that something was amiss and instructed them to fix it. There'd been a lot of A-B splitting of this. It was there in the codebase and the unit tests for anyone to see. And the most successful strategy the buildings had found for correcting humans was to pretend that they didn't exist. So, if you planted a piece of structural steel in a way that the buildings really couldn't work with and ignored the rising chorus of warnings, someone would be told that there was a piece of misaligned material and was tasked to it with high urgency. It was the same building the error the buildings generated if something slipped. The error didn't assume that a human being had fucked up through malice or incompetence. The initial theory had been that an error without a responsible party would be more socially graceful. People doubled down on their mistakes, especially when embarrassed in front of their peers. The name and shame alternate versions had shown that hot-cheeked, fierce denial was the biggest impediment to standing up any building. So, if you fucked up, soon someone would turn up with a mecha, or a forklift, or a screwdriver, and a job ticket to unfuck the thing that you were percussively maintaining into submission. You could pretend that you were doing the same job as that new guy, part of the solution instead of the cause of the problem. This let you save face, so that you wouldn't insist that you were doing it right and that the building's stupid instructions and everything else in the universe was wrong. But reality was chewily weirder in a way that Limpopo loved. It turned out that if you were dispatched to defubar something and found someone who was obviously the source of the infubarage, you could completely tell that that structural steel wasn't 3 degrees off true because of slippage. It was 3 degrees off true because some dipshit flubbed it. What's more, Senor Dipshit knew that you knew that he was at fault. But the fact that the trouble ticket read, urgent, read true, structural member minus 3 degrees at 120 degrees north-northeast, and not urgent, read true, structural member minus 3 degrees at 120 degrees north-northeast because some dipshit can't follow instructions, let both of you do this mannered kabuki in which you operated in the third-person passive voice. The beam has become off true, not you fucked up that beam. This pretense, the researchers called it networked social disattention, but everyone else called it the how did that get there effect, was a vital shift in the UNHCR's distributed shelter initiative. Prior to that, it had all been gamified to fuckery, with leaderboards for the most correct installs and the best looters. Test builds were marred by angry confrontations and fistfights. And even this was a virtue, since every build would fissure into 2 or 3 subgroups, each putting up their own buildings. It was 3 for the price of 1. And inevitably, these forked-off projects would be less ambitious than the original plan. Early sites had a characteristic look. A wide, flat, low building, the first 3 stories of something that had been planned for 10 before half the workers quit. 100 meters away, there'd be 3 more buildings, each half the size of the first, representing the forked and reforked buildings revenge built by alienated splitters. Some sites had Fibonacci spirals of ever smaller forks terminating in a single hostility-radiating Wendy house. The buildings made the leap from the UNHCR repo to the walkaways and mutated into innumerable variations beyond the clinic, school, shelter, refugee trinity. The Belt and Braces was the first tavern ever attempted. Layouts for restaurant kitchens weren't far off from camp kitchens, and big common spaces were easy enough, but the actual zeitgeist of the thing was substantially different, tweaked in 1,000 ways that you'd never walk into one and say, this is a refugee residence that's been converted to a restaurant. And you'd never mistake the Belt and Braces for a normal restaurant. Its major feature was the projection-mapped lighting that painted surfaces and items throughout its interior with subtle red-green tones, telling you where something needed human attention. This was the UNHCR playbook, but again, there was a world of difference between dishing up MREs to climate refugees and serving fancy dry ice cocktails made from wet printers and powdered alcohol. No refugee camp ever went through quite so many cocktail parasols and perfect knot swizzle sticks. So I think I'll stop the reading there. Thank you. So, thanks. Let's see how this works. There we go. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Now, I'm a science fiction writer, and people erroneously believe that being a science fiction writer gives you some insight into the future. There are even science fiction writers, God help us, who believe this, and thankfully they're wrong. Now, some science fiction predictions have come true, but given how many predictions science fiction had made, it would be alarming if none of them had. Still, you'd probably get a better level of accuracy just by throwing dice. But even though I have no pretense to being able to predict the future, I am really intensely interested in what future we will get. Specifically, I'm really interested in how we produce a better future than the one that we're currently on the glide path towards. The climate crisis, exacerbated by grotesque inequality and attended by pogroms and pandemics that leave behind ash heaps governed by sadistic autocrats. Now, there is a lot of science fiction that will tell you that story. After all, science fiction is a pulp literature, and in pulp literature, plot always comes first, which means that science fiction writers don't want to choose between the two great plots, man versus man and man versus nature. Given that choice, they'll merge them into man versus nature versus man, which is where a tsunami knocks your house down and then your neighbors come over to eat you. So thank goodness science fiction does not predict the future. In fact, thank goodness that nobody can predict the future. And the reason that nobody can predict the future is because what future we get changes based on what we do. Believers in a predictable future sometimes call themselves optimists and sometimes call themselves pessimists. But if you believe in a predictable future, what you are is a fatalist. You believe that the future will arrive no matter what action we take. And I am not a fatalist, I'm an activist. I believe that what we do can change the future. I believe the stories we tell ourselves can change what we do, and therefore change the future. So take that man versus nature versus man story. You don't have to read science fiction to encounter this story. You can find it alive and well in the toxic doctrine of eco-fascists. These are people who believe that the solution to climate change is to kill half of humanity, the brown half. They tell themselves stories about how there's this great event coming, this rupture in which everything will break down. And then the lesser people will storm their borders and take their things. Like all racist beliefs, this is a demented fantasy. And yet, many of us find it easy to believe that if things get bad, the big problem is going to be that our neighbors will come over and eat us. And this isn't just a paranoid belief, it's a factually, empirically wrong belief. As the historian Rebecca Solnit documents in her outstanding 2009 book, A Paradise Built in Hell, crises are when we come together. They're not when we turn on each other. Specifically, crises starting with the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco and moving on to Katrina and Sandy and the earthquake in Haiti. These are moments in which that background refrigerator hum of petty grievance stops and leaves behind a kind of ringing silence in which you realize that you have more in common with your neighbors than you ever imagined, and whatever grudges you are nursing against them are irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. Crises are when people rise magnificently to the occasion. When the lights go out, your neighbors aren't coming over to your house with a shotgun, they're coming over to your house with a casserole dish. And if that's what actually happens, why is it so hard to convince people that the opposite is true? Well, it's a complex story with a lot of factors, but at least part of it is a well-documented cognitive bias called the availability heuristic. Now, that's when we assume that things that are easier to imagine are more likely to occur. It's what convinces us that we're at high risk from plane crashes, despite the rarity, or that we should worry about poison in our kids' Halloween candy, despite the fact that this has literally never happened. This is why stories matter, not just because they inspire us to better futures, but because they can inform our intuition about the inevitability of worse futures to come, convincing us that a crisis will always become a catastrophe when our neighbor's secret lurking bestiality is revealed. Now, this belief is not just toxic, it's profoundly statistically innumerate. Now, if 99.99% of the world is made up of sadistic sociopaths, what are the odds that you and me and all the people we know are just basically okay? People who do the best that they can and sometimes do things that they regret. which is how I came to write Walkaway. Walkaway is a novel in which the super rich have automated away so many jobs that most of us have become surplus to requirements, even as climate change has continued to blight more and more of the earth, turning it into brownfield no man's land sites. And in this novel, those people simply walk away. They take over the brownfield sites, use drones to catalog the wreckage in the nearby ruins, and use software to design new buildings that use that material. They build these automated luxury resorts where small amounts of human labor are decomposed into individual tasks that anyone can perform, with the effect that you have these free autonomous zones that anyone can come and live in and use. Now, primarily, these get used as staging grounds for orienting new walkaways and planning new automated luxury resorts. The book's plot revolves around a crisis that's precipitated when researchers who've been working for the super rich have a breakthrough that allows them to see a world in which they'll be able to bequeath practical immortality to humans. And at that moment, they also have a crisis of conscience. They're unwilling to be complicit in the speciating of the human race into infinitely prolonged oligarchs and the mayflies disappearing in their rearview mirrors. So they steal these secrets, the secrets that they developed, and they bring them to the walkaways with the intention to liberate them and make them universally available, universal access to immortality. And that's when the shooting starts, because that's when the oligarchs realize that they're going to be stuck with the rest of us for all of time. And that brings out the Hellfire missiles. Now, fundamentally, Walkaway is a novel about abundance, which is a subject near and dear to economics and a subject that's had a bad rap in environmental thinking. Abundance is often conflated with capitalism's drive for eternal growth. And it's caught up in critiques dating all the way back to 1972 and the Limits to Growth paper from the Club of Rome. But abundance has meant many different things at different technological moments. When our ability to make tools was limited, abundance was a function of how many naturally occurring tools we could find. How many rock-based tools you could have was based on how many rocks that were already shaped like the tool that you could locate. Then we developed techniques for refining natural materials, which gave us a new kind of abundance. We didn't need to find rocks that were the right shape. We needed to find rocks that we could make into the right shape to do the thing that we use the rocks for. As our ability to refine raw materials expanded, so did the reach of abundance. Not because we were finding more rocks of the right shape, but because we were finding more ways to do the things that we use those rocks for. Technological advancements allow us to trade some combination of labor and energy for the right materials. You don't have to have hydrogen, but if you don't have hydrogen but you do have electricity, you can use electrolysis and crack hydrogen atoms out of water molecules. Capitalism is a major driver of this innovation because labor and materials and energy are costs that erode capitalist margins, and so the market is always finding ways to create these efficiencies. The embodied labor and energy and materials in manufactured goods are a fraction of their recent forebears. The Limits to Growth paper infamously imagined that we would run out of cars within a few decades because we would just run out of the world's budget for steel to make cars out of. But the amount of steel in a modern car, it's a tiny fraction of the steel that was in the cars in 1972. Or think of buildings. The amount of labor and energy and materials needed to enclose 1 cubic meter of space, whether that's housing or retail or manufacturing, has been in free fall for generations with no end in sight. Now, this insight that we would have this monotonic ratcheting down of the materials and energy and resources and labor was what prompted Keynes to write Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, in which he infamously predicted that by 2030, our descendants would only be working a few days a week and would be showered with all the material luxuries they could possibly need. But Keynes had not reckoned with the flexibility of desire, with demand elasticity. The idea that marketing would be a praxis of its own, a technology to convince people to want new things, even as new things became available. Now, this is not the worst thing in the world, although again, marketing is another thing that gets a kind of bad rap. The expectation that your children will all survive to adulthood, that's a relatively new one, and it was sold to us. It was marketed to us through public health programs that fundamentally changed our expectations about the kind of life and comfort that we could expect. Our ability to make things that more efficiently has been locked in a Red Queen's race with our ability to convince ourselves to want more of the things that we make. But abundance isn't merely a function of what we can make, nor is it merely a function of what we want. It is a function of both of those at the intersection of how we distribute what we can make. Even when you have a lot, who gets what and where and when, that's the hard problem. Orthodox economics say that markets are the best way to make these allocation decisions, that computing who should get what when would consume more computing power than we could possibly muster, so instead we have to use markets as giant non-deterministic computers to aggregate the choices and preferences of buyers and sellers to zero in on ever more efficient allocations. And in recent years, we've seen markets deploy computing power to do allocations that are kind of fractional allocations, where instead of owning a thing, you merely acquire the use of it very briefly. So rather than owning a car, you could subscribe to a car sharing service, the service that gives you a car exactly when you need it and tucks it away neatly in a reserved parking bay when you don't. The car can be serviced and maintained and fueled and cleaned by someone else and accumulate data about its driving and usage that can be mined to improve this service and the design of future cars. And there's a lot to like about this model. What if we don't all need our own cars or anything else that could be efficiently allocated and reallocated with networks, from hammers to lawnmowers to suitcases, and instead, at the moment that we need one of these things, it appears in a form that was better than we could have afforded or created at sufficient scale to give everyone one, and then when we're done with it, it whisks itself away to the next person who needs it. And at the end of its duty cycle, it gracefully decomposes back into the material stream, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of usage data so that its successor can be made even better. The problem with this arrangement is not what's being done, but who it's being done for and who it's being done to. The problem is that when these systems are run as for-profit, market-based entities, they become primarily rent seekers. They don't replace private property with communally owned or shared property. They replace private property with digital feudalism. Digital feudalism is when only one actor in the economy gets to own property, an aristocracy, and everyone else uses that property in accord with the wishes and desires and whims of the aristocrats. And in digital feudalism, the aristocrats aren't human beings. In digital feudalism, aristocrats are immortal transhuman colony organisms called limited liability companies that treat humans as their inconvenient gut flora. So this is where science fiction comes in. Science fiction has a signature move. Science fiction can imagine a technology divorced from its social and economic context. As in, what would the so-called share economy look like if it was run by cooperatives or by the state? Under capitalism, we're encouraged to equate abundance with, I currently own the things I currently or might need in the future. But having to own and maintain and keep track of everything you need and everything you might need is not a luxury, it's a burden. Think of toilet paper. If you've ever gone backpacking somewhere where they don't have a lot of money or resources, you may have found yourself carrying a roll of toilet paper with you everywhere you go. Wealthy, prosperous societies do not demand that we each carry around our own grubby, disintegrating toilet roll. In well-managed civilizations, there is always toilet paper at the moment that you need it, and you don't have to think about it. That's what abundance looks like. And it not only means that you don't have to devote your scarce mental resources to the pointless task of toilet paper management, it also means that you use less toilet paper overall. There's less wastage from having everyone carrying around toilet paper until it falls apart. And we can set standards for that toilet paper and for its material inputs that are well matched with both our plumbing and our sources of cellulosic plant-based material. Abundance, then, is the intersection of our available inputs, that's material and labor and energy, our ability to use them efficiently, that's our praxis, and what we want, that's our desire, and how we allocate them, that's our coordination. Seen in this light, there are plenty of ways to imagine continuous growth without limits. We can imagine that growth coming from improved allocation, or from the rise of a Zen movement that makes us want less. Think of Marie Kondo and her project to convince us that all we ever really needed was a single smooth river rock that reminds us of our mother, right? If you could technologize that, you could have abundance with far less things. Or think of improved techniques to make more out of less, with less energy and less labor and less material. Or think of better distribution that puts your desired object in your hand when you need it and sends it to someone else when you don't. This is a model for what some have called fully automated luxury communism, and it's really the animating principle behind the novel Walkaway. They are living as though it were the first days of a better nation, consciously, deliberately trying to create a new civilization in parallel to the failing world of the oligarchy, built on human thriving and not markets. The idea of fully automated luxury communism, it's fascinating and it's captivating, and it animates such utopian notions as the universal basic income, premised on a near future in which automation will obviate nearly all of human labor. But I want to talk about a competing utopian vision, one that's much more urgent and much closer to hand. A vision of a centuries-long, species-wide project that would consume all the labor and energy and materials that we have, as well as those of our children, our grandchildren, their children, and their descendants besides. Something that will tax our best networks' coordinating capabilities and demand new praxis and a radical rethinking of what we want, all at the same time. And that's the Green New Deal. For the Green New Deal to save our species and ensure that our planet remains habitable by our species, every one of us is going to have to devote ourselves to a complete shift in our social and political organization. We all have to reorient our productive capacity toward not just low-carbon versions of the artifacts that give us ease and comfort, but also around mass-scale climate remediation, be that emergency shelters for people who are climate refugees or entire new cities to house people whose old cities have been burned or drowned. This vision is fundamentally incompatible with fully automated luxury communism. If we create a robot that displaces 100 million workers, the Green New Deal has new jobs for them, helping with levees, or caring work, or pandemic prevention, or firefighting, or a million other new jobs that we haven't even dreamt of yet. The Green New Deal imagines full employment for our descendants, paying down the technical debt we've incurred not just by our carbon use, but by building in low-lying coastal areas, floodplains, and wildfire zones in the lowlands. But the Green New Deal has a problem. How do we pay all those people to do that work? How do we pay for the material and energy inputs for all that work? And so we're back to allocation, figuring out the best way to mobilize materials, energy, and labor to optimize human thriving. Now, orthodox market economics, it says that we can't do this, that our world of rational, utility-maximizing, selfish actors will instead always make short-term choices that allocate our labor and materials and energy to Happy Meal toys, fart machine apps, and energy drinks. But this is circular reasoning. The reason we've been told to use markets to allocate things is because they maximize human thriving. And humans can't thrive when we allow the only known planet capable of sustaining human life to be degraded to the point where it can no longer do that. This is a high-stakes macrocosmic version of the economic conundrum that happens in every recession. So you have a factory that makes things that people want. You have workers who want to work in that factory. You have suppliers who want to give it energy and materials. And then you have a spreadsheet that says that the factory isn't viable and that the workers have to be thrown out of work. And rather than coming to the conclusion that something is wrong with the spreadsheet, we declare the factory to be non-viable and shut it down. Now, this circular reasoning, where if markets can't figure out how to do it, it's not worth doing, it's our great motif of late-stage capitalism. People want to live in a house, the neighbors don't want the house to be vacant and blighted, but the mortgage lender is blowing up the borrower's teaser mortgage rate to a stonking high monthly interest rate, and therefore the owners of the house must be dispossessed and evicted. Inequality is corrosive and destabilizing and threatens the legacy of democratic states, but the spreadsheets say it's impossible to redistribute wealth to the super rich, so we just have to tolerate it. But if the basis for relying on markets is that they make efficient allocations, then these grossly existentially inefficient allocations should militate for alternatives to markets. But instead, we're told there is no alternative. This is a very dirty rhetorical trick, because when you say there is no alternative, what you really mean is, God damn it, stop trying to think of an alternative. It's the most anti-science fictional credo you can imagine. Remember science fiction's signature move, divorcing technologies from their economic and social context. Now, the origin of the doctrine of market supremacy dates back 100 years to the 1920s, when the archdukes of market thought, von Mises and von Hayek, claimed that you could never build a computer sophisticated enough to perform the calculations necessary to allocate resources in complex societies. This socialist calculation debate framed markets as necessary and framed their failures as necessary evils. If there was just no way to compute the math to figure out the best way to allocate labor and capital and materials and energy, then we had to use markets. And if those markets produced incredibly wealthy oligarchs or destructive pollution or vicious armed conflicts, well, that was the price that we paid for the otherwise efficient allocations that we got everywhere else. But the predictions about the power of computation in the 1920s turned out to be a little pessimistic. In the years since, we have built massive non-market institutions that are the same order of magnitude size as the USSR in 1989, that allocate by calculation, not by markets. There's a couple of the big ones you might have heard of: the People's Liberation Army and the Pentagon, largest employer in the world, or Amazon. Right? When you get a job at Amazon, you don't get a system of bids and puts that you use to figure out what desk you'll sit at and how many pencils you get. Instead, Party Secretary Bezos has his 5-year plan, and his commissars execute it with a command and control system grounded in data and computation. Now, science fiction can take the imaginative leap that says, what if instead of having all those decisions dictated by an autocrat, we put them under democratic control? What if we diverted the profits that are currently sent back to investors and used it for R&D to replace the grueling labor in the factories, warehouses, and delivery systems with automated systems that would free up precious human decision-making and labor to work on remediating climate change? What if we had, in the words of Lee Phillips and Michael Rosworski, a People's Republic of Walmart? Imagining these large-scale, efficient institutions under democratic control is a radical act. It conjures up a future in which we retain the parts of capitalism that we enjoy, the choice and the convenience, while refusing to allow it to externalize its costs, like poor labor conditions and carbon footprints. The argument against them is that the people who initially allocated the capital to create these institutions we might take over deserve to control them, because the market identified them as the moral superiors of their fellows. But back in 1920, when those Austrians were insisting that we had to use markets to allocate, they said that these extreme wealth concentrations were a necessary evil, not a badge of moral superiority. And little by little in the century since, we've been convinced that to be made wealthy by markets is a sign of moral virtue, and that virtue and wealth are therefore interchangeable. It's the ultimate in circular reasoning. A market society that makes the virtuous wealthy, and therefore wealthy people are virtuous, and if it seems like some virtuous people are poor, they must have some hidden defect that the market has found out. Or in other words, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? This circularity has created a new global aristocracy whose intellectual and moral failings are obvious to everyone who isn't an aristocrat or who doesn't fancy themselves an aristocrat in waiting. Exhibit A being the insistence that it's impossible to maintain the Earth for human habitation because the spreadsheets say it's impossible. Or the nonsensical comparisons between sovereign currency issuers and households to justify austerity in the name of paying down the national credit card. The idea that you can't pay for climate change remediation or humane social programs without taking away people's money by taxing them, when in reality, all money is spent into existence by national governments and currency issuers when they buy services and goods and tax back out of existence as a means of preventing wealth concentration and fighting inflation. If the government taxed no more than it spent, it would take away all the money in the economy. Every deficit on the government side of the ledger is a credit on the people's side of the ledger. In other words, all the money in circulation is the result of deficit spending, and without deficits, there'd be no money for us people to use. Now, I want to spend the last part of this talk imagining what a future of well-allocated resources oriented towards maximizing human thriving and a permanently habitable Earth would look like. A world of real abundance. In particular, let's think about what computational coordination could provide us in terms of our leisure and work. Now, industrial production fundamentally changed our relationship to leisure. In agriculture, we once made hay while the sun shone and devised a range of tasks that we could take indoors when it was raining or snowing. The same was true of craft practice. A carpenter might work outside sanding and sawing on a sunny day and move inside to paint and stain when it was raining. But these forms of labor were extremely unproductive, and they required much greater energy, labor, and material inputs than the industrial production that came after them. With industrial production, we decomposed complex tasks into subtasks that needed to be done in a certain sequence. The conveyor belt moves apart into your workspace and you tighten it, and then the belt moves on and the next part is brought before you. Now, this did produce vastly improved productivity. It gave us more better stuff that used less material, energy, and labor. But it did so at the cost of human autonomy. You can't just step away from the assembly line, no matter how badly you need to pee, or no matter how beautiful a day it is outside. If you do so, the person downstream from you can't do their job. But we are on the verge of a new post-industrial production that's much more flexible, where we have things already in the information space like wikis and source control tools like Git, that allow people to collaborate across great stretches of time and space without knowing each other or even explicitly deciding to collaborate with one another. This digital infrastructure, it acts as a kind of scaffold that can catch, support, and organize human labor. Now, in Walkway, I tried to imagine what a world would be like in which we could have the same kind of organizational structures, but for things like buildings or space programs. But such a vision isn't just usable in a fully automated luxury communist future. It's also very applicable to a Green New Deal. After all, the most persistent critique of an all-renewable energy transition is what happens when the wind stops blowing or the sun goes down or the tides are quiet. Where do we get our power? But what if we could use networks to coordinate our most energy-intensive activities for when the power was available? Today, for example, we only smelt aluminum when there's a dam nearby the smelter that is producing more energy than the grid can take up. And then we smelt the aluminum, which is a very energy-intensive process. It effectively acts as a battery because it removes aluminum smelting from the base load that we need energy for the rest of the time. We also have data centers that only turn on when the ambient temperature is so low that they can be run without chillers. And when the ambient temperature rises, the data center just shuts down. The first of those was built here in Belgium. Now imagine if other tasks could be so coordinated. When your local power grid is making the energy needed for some important task, people could be summoned to work that suited their needs and their tastes. But when the power was reduced, the task would shift to somewhere else where the sun was shining or the wind was blowing, and everyone would be given time off, and our automated systems would be used not to dictate where we would work, but to help us find people to socialize with, someone else to have a feast day with. Science fiction is good at helping us think about where we want to get to, but it's less useful for telling us how to get there. Reality is messy, and novels, or at least the good ones, are neat. The path from A to Z isn't visible from where we are now, and instead of tracing that path, which would after all change as soon as we embarked on it, because we have adversaries, people who practice a doctrine you might call hydrocarbonism, who would like to rearrange the map so that whatever path we take is stymied. So instead of following a path that we set ahead of time, we need rules of thumb, or what computer scientists call heuristics. Now, a key heuristic for navigating complex spaces is what computer scientists call hill climbing. That's where you give a software agent a simple rule. Wherever you find yourself, check to see which direction goes up in the most steepest incline and take a step that way. And once you're there, check to see which direction takes you up in the most steepest incline again, and again, and again. Step by step, without knowing the path and without knowing the terrain, you can find the highest point available from where you are now. If we can agree on an approximate vision, we can all start from wherever we are and all climb together without having to follow the same path and still arrive at the same summit. And the good news is that far more people than ever are finally ready to start climbing. And that's because we have passed the moment of peak indifference. Peak indifference is a critical juncture in the life cycle of any activist cause. When those causes are first joined, the activist's primary job is to convince people that there is a problem at all, especially when the problem is a long way off from the actions that cause it, and when the effects are hard to associate with those causes. Like when you release CO2 and then 50 or 100 years later, your city catches fire or drowns. And it doesn't get any easier when your political adversaries have got deep pockets and they're spending money to confuse people about the science. But over time, even if you don't manage to convince people, if the problem remains unaddressed, they start to convince themselves because the problem only gets worse. You accumulate so much technical debt that the interest payments on that debt become very visible and then absolutely undeniable. You get floods, fire, pandemics, refugee crises, famines. And at a certain point, an activist's job is no longer to convince people that there is a problem. The activist's job is to convince people that it's not too late to do something about it. That's the moment of peak indifference. And it's an important moment because it marks a real shift in our strategies from fighting denialism to fighting nihilism. Because if someone only acknowledges that rhinos are going extinct when there's only one left, there is a strong possibility that they might decide to eat them. After all, by that point, you might as well find out what rhino tastes like. We are living through that transition from denial to nihilism right now. As the far right abandons its irrational belief that climate change is a hoax, they are pivoting swiftly to eco-fascism, the belief that the only way to remediate climate change is to exterminate brown people. That belief was espoused by the Christchurch shooter and by Anders Breivik. Ecofascism is grounded in the belief that humans can't remediate climate change or transition to green fuel sources, and instead must pursue a degrowth until the population falls to a level that simply requires less energy, fewer material inputs, and less labor. That's not just a counsel of despair, and it's not merely an odious racist doctrine, it's also wrong. Irreversible aspects of climate change are already underway, and we will need all hands to weather the literal storms that are coming, as well as the more figurative ones, the fires, the floods, the pandemics. And that's why the Green New Deal is the most urgent story to tell ourselves today, because it holds out the possibility for a common destination that we can all climb towards. And a vision of a future where humans are not obsolete and not destined to spend the rest of time lying on divans being fed laser-peeled grapes by robots, but one where humans have an urgent purpose, bound together in solidarity, to renew our planet and our relations to one another. Because if there's one thing science fiction tells us, it's that there really is an alternative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I know that there may well be a whole lot of questions or builds or just a request to re-articulate exactly what you said, that about immortal somethings that treat human beings as their gut flora, that I know I'm going to definitely want to capture. But I'm going to suggest we hold that and immediately move to a dialogue with a different perspective, and one that will come at this point from Tom Bowler. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
As you want.
As I want, okay. So let's build with that. So Tom is a professor of ecological economics at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, so homegrown and home resident. He studies environmental policy and how social and socio-technical innovation is captured by social and political actors. And in particular, he is one of the few people and important people working on beyond GDP. What are the alternative economic indicators for value in the worlds that we are creating and that we are seeking to move away from? And an institutionalization in terms of the policy agenda. So there are a number of experiences and expertise in terms of how transitions operate, can operate, might operate, the governance of transitions that sits behind his work. And with that, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you. Did you find all of that on the internet, actually? Because I started to be a little bit worried, actually. Thanks. So I think the basic idea of Alberto was that I should speak something like 45 minutes, and then some people would reply to it. So I tried to do a little bit less than a 45 because, well, it's a lab. It's not a face-to-face sort of interaction sort of thing. The question which I better put forward, I think it was yesterday for me, is to speak precisely to you about help the audience understand why some of the economics in science fiction is not taken seriously in mainstream academia. So that's what I'm trying to stick to a little bit. I'm not English. I'm not American. I'm not English speaking as Corey is. So it's going to be much more amateuresque. I'm also normally speaking to students and to these sort of to colleagues. So I'm not trying to make a grand narrative about this. I read actually the book and I tried to identify some of the economic stuff within it, because there's a lot of it. There's also sex in it and a lot of these normal things, I would say. But there's also a little bit of economics in it. I picked some of the things up where I think I can sort of say something about it. I cannot say something about all of economics. I'm, as has been said, I'm specialized in environmental issues and more particularly in governance issues related to nature-society interactions. And so it will be a short part of the entire sort of book and of all the economics which is addressed in the book, or which has been addressed also now in this speech. And I'm speaking from a actually pretty comfortable position, because I'm I'm not really an economist, actually, sort of. I always find it a little bit, how to say that, disappointing if people call me an economist. I studied economics, that's true, that's some 20 years ago, and on my door, my office door is marked ecological economist, and on my card also, and all that sort of stuff. But I'm not an economist. I'm working not at the Faculty of Economics. I'm not working at Solvay, a business school, which is our Faculty of Economics at ULB, where you go to tomorrow, apparently. I'm working at the Faculty for Sciences. So I'm working, the guy who has the office just beside me, he's a mathematician. The other guy is a physicist and all that sort of stuff. So I'm the weird guy, and some of my colleagues too, the social scientist within the Faculty of Sciences. And that has something which is very interesting. If you try to imagine what economics can do, what the economic stuff is supposed to do to society, that brings you into a very, very nice situation, because you don't have to struggle with these bad mainstream guys, you know, with the guys who are neoliberals or whatever, because they are sitting in another faculty and you actually don't give a shit about what they're saying, sort of, and they don't give a shit about what you're saying. So, but actually, quite a lot of the environmentally relevant and the environmentally a little bit radical sort of thinking in the economics business, so to speak, in the academia, is happening outside of the economics faculties, and that is very particular to environmental people, and that is a little bit linked also to the history of the stuff. You showed limits to growth. That is basically has been in the first instance has been computer scientists meeting some natural scientists, and they try to figure out what happens with what they called at that time computers. But the basic fun they had is to run the computers. The rest was a little bit a side sort of kick for them. And it's a little bit the same in my faculty in general. That is, we're trying to understand what does the society, nature, environments sort of interface, interaction, interrelationships. But we don't necessarily care a lot about the very heavy sort of baggage the normal mainstream economists has to carry, actually, because we don't need to cater that, and we don't need to relate to that. So it's a very comfortable situation, basically. And that is important to say, that we grasp this, because I'm speaking from a non-economics professional sort of point of view. And to my understanding, there is not really something like a mainstream economics. And the question which Alberto put forward is, what does mainstream economics do against the sort of stuff you're thinking about? There is no mainstream economics. At the ULB, and that's a very basic university, kind of a small university, even for European standards, there is not a mainstream economic guy or girl. People don't do that. In the research world, there is a whole richness of things going on, and people don't really carry the neoliberalist sort of cap on their heads all the time. They are Marxists, or they're looking at commons, and there are some people around here, and that sort of stuff. But they are not mainstream economics. They don't defend the ISLM sort of graph. It's not that what they are working on. The thing they're working on is much more elaborate, and that is probably part of the problem, that the way I think what economics is about is told to the outside world, in particular to press, in particular to politicians or to policy people, is hyper simplified against what they are working on actually in terms of research. And the outside world, to a certain extent, still gets the idea that there's an offer and a demand sort of curve, this X thing there, and that everything is along that sort of thing, and that there are rational agents, and all economists believe in rational agents, which is absolutely not true. If you speak to economists, there's no rational agent. The thing is that they are sort of obliged to teach that sort of stuff, If you speak to students, and at ULB and in many other universities, there's a sort of a halfway big process going on to force faculty, economics faculties, to open up in terms of teaching, not in terms of research. Research is sort of fine, but in terms of teaching. Because students, economics students, and me myself, I experienced that also, they are running through over a curriculum which actually doesn't make a lot of sense. Neither in terms of the sportivity behind it, because that was part of the colleagues that I had when I was a student. They were actually they wanted to study math, but they weren't good enough for that, so they went to economics, which is a sort of applied math thing. So and that's fine, but they are there for the sports. If there would be a faculty of chess playing, they would do that, But that is not what it is about, basically. But the teaching is really that. The teaching is, there's and have formulas and equations and that sort of stuff. But that's not very interesting. And that's also the stuff the story behind economics that actually you see in the press. That there is a truth about economic dynamics. And that we know what happens out there, and that if GDP drops by half a point, then something else climbs by 2 points or something like that, that sort of thing. But it doesn't. It isn't like that, It's really not. You know that it isn't, but even the economists, they know that it is not, but they still teach it, sort of. So it's a very difficult sort of situation, and that's why I'm speaking of myself as being somebody who is in a very comfortable position, because I teach to non-economics students. I teach to all over the disciplines, and I try to teach them a little bit what ecological economics is about and this sort of stuff. So I don't have to care about all these graphs and all these equations and all those things. Okay, the thing is, and that's where the struggle begins with my colleagues from the Faculty of Economics, is that most of them actually think that students should run through this. That you have to do that thing, 4 or 5 years of the very classical sort of equation, mathematized, kind of stupid economics. And you will have, by the end, in your last years, you have 1 or 2 option courses on Marxism or that sort of stuff. That's fine. But all the rest, you have to do that in order to be able to carry the label as being an economist. And then only if you can do that, you can start to really dive into the critique of, for instance, GDP or macroeconomic dynamics or that sort of things. But students should be taught economics as it was sort of sketched by Keynes 70, 80 years ago, and then they are fine. And what they do from then they can start, they have the finesse to understand what the critiques is about. I have to say, I have a lot of colleagues who absolutely didn't study at all economics, and quite a lot of them are, for instance, in the very small research domain on alternative indicators, macroeconomic indicators, what is called beyond GDP, grossly. They are very proficient to list you the 10 biggest critiques that GDP raises. It doesn't account for this, it doesn't account for that. It's it doesn't, all that sort of stuff. And people basically can list very easily these 10 critiques, and I'm sure all of you can do that quite easily. The thing is that there is something to it. If you didn't run through the sort of indoctrination over 5 years, you didn't really get the spirit of that GDP sort of thing, and about the dynamic and about all that sort of stuff. And so you don't really grasp what it means that prostitution is not accurately accounted for in this number, which is something there's a general critique we have about GDP. There's shadow economic activities, and they're not carried in the number. But what it really does mean to the entire models and the dynamics and that sort of stuff is very difficult to grasp if you didn't run through all that sort of 5-year boot camp about the equations. So there is something to that, which is a little bit true, that to a certain extent, you probably need to run through that indoctrination before you are able to sort of loosen yourself and free your minds and invent your proper theory of change. And that is maybe something which is relevant here for the science fiction lab, because if you understand where we are starting from, that is the mainstream sort of economics, then you need to really get interested in what it actually represents and what is Keynesianism, what is Marxism, and that sort of stuff. And more than 3 minutes, sort of, Capital is really big to read, so it's something which is really difficult. Okay. One thing is which has been mentioned both, I think, by Kirsten and also by Corey, is that economics has the aspect of being solid. I think you said it in the introduction, basically. You said that we sort of has these KPIs, I think you said, which is basically, performance indicators, which we should try to fulfill. And then if we do that, we're staying into, within the boundaries of what normal, suitable economic activities should be. I studied a little, after my economics, I got so frustrated about, the whole science stuff. I really didn't understand anything anymore. I went to people who actually do something which is today called the sociology of science, philosophy and sociology of science. In France, in Paris, there's a famous one which is called Bruno Latour. There are others around a little bit, and that is sort of my secondary field. So to try to understand how the science argument, the science things, the processes are basically configured, constructed as a social sort of activity, And if you have that lens on and these sort of glasses on and you're looking at the solid economics, you very easily run into some bizarreries to a certain extent. The Maastricht criteria, that's a good example. There's a whole set of Maastricht criteria. That's the Eurozone sort of criteria, which allow you to enter the Eurozone and which allow you to not get a fine by the European Commission as long as you stay more or less within the France never does, the Italians neither, that sort of stuff. It's a discussion in terms of operationalization and execution. But actually, we never had really the discussion about why we have this criteria. One of the criteria reads more or less as the following, that you have to try and keep your economies, your budgets, public budgets, your deficits, at a maximum of 3% against your GDP growth per year, okay? You see that there's growth of economics, and you should not do more deficit than 3% of that growth, that economic growth, 3%. Why? Does anybody know why that 3%? Yeah, that's what we imagine. Yeah, that's what we imagine. You know how the story goes, and it's a real story. Is that when Maastricht that was the 90s more or less, when they discussed Maastricht, they already had that sort of turnaround of the presidencies of the European institutions, and at that precise time when they started to finalize the negotiations about the Maastricht criteria, it was France, and the minister at that then in these turnaround things, the guy who is the minister of the economics, probably minister of the economics, I assume, of France, he's the president of the working group with all the other ministers of the economics of the member states. And so he has to put on the table a proposal. The guy forgot that there was this thing about the criteria. And they had to go the other day, to Brussels. At that time there was no TGV, so they went by car, and they had to go to Brussels with actually a proposal. What are the criteria and what are the numbers? So the guy called, I don't recall the name of the minister, but the guy called actually his assistant. He said, fuck, I'm sorry, I need to have numbers, I need to have criteria by tomorrow morning. Okay? So what did the guy do? He phoned up 3 of his mates, they went to eat, and by the end of the dinner, they had the criteria. And they had the 3%. They started actually off, the guy said, we need to have a percentage deficit against GDP. Let's have 1%. That's super strict, okay? 1% is really super, super strict. His friend said, no, wait, no. France, we will never do it, We do 4 now, so if we're really going to be strict, we can do 2. Okay, and then the other said, okay, let's have 3. We are sure to be within, with a little bit of effort, but it looks cool. 3 is good, let's have 3. So that's 3. And that's the solidness, There's no big calculus, there's no computer running or whatever. There's not even a political negotiation about that. Not even that. And it's not a conflict between Marxist views on deficit spending and Keynesianism and whatever. It's not none of that. And that's because there is no sound numbers in economics. There's another really, really famous number, which is It's again debt related. You're not supposed, or you were not supposed to do more than 90%. I think it was 90%. No. That's Maastricht. Here is something else. You're not supposed to have more than 90% of public debt, 90% against your GDP again, of public debt. Otherwise, all the models show that next year your GDP growth will plummet, decrease drastically. And that sort of figure, that 90%, is actually something which came out of a spreadsheet calculation by two people who are called Rogoff and Reinhardt, a girl and a man and a woman, both from Harvard Business School, so quite intelligent people actually, probably. 90%, and much of the World Bank and of the International Monetary Fund sort of thinks, when do you give more money to the African countries? They looked at this 90 sort of percent threshold. At one point, actually, a PhD candidate from the university, from Boston University, which is against Howard, sort of a tiny idiot. It's for the guys who are not good enough for MIT in Boston, for MIT and Howard. They go to Boston University. They have an exercise in the first year of PhD candidates in economics that is take whatever paper and redo the calculations. Take the data, redo the calculations, which is a very idiotic sort of exercise, but it's, by doing calculations that you learn how to do calculations. And so the guy actually, he called Rogoff, and he said, could I have your spreadsheet? I have this exercise to do. It's really a stupid thing, but I have to recalculate. Could you give me the data? I just redo this thing. And he thought it was a 2-minute exercise, He got the data. Rogoff was quite cool to do the calculation, all that sort of stuff. We can even maybe meet or whatever and discuss it through if you have difficulties. Overnight, the guy did the calculations with the spreadsheet sort of data stuff, and he found there was no 90%. It was 180 or something like that, or whatever, double. I don't recall, 160 or something like that. Which is, African countries got refused money because there was this 90%, because it would fuck up the future sort of growth, What happened is that Rogoff and Reinhardt, they did an error. When you do spreadsheet calculations, you want to have the formula actually, repeated to all your cells in a column. You drag it down. How many of you did, the fingers slipped and it didn't went to the end? That's what happened. The formula didn't go to the end of the spreadsheet because it was like 10,000 rows, because it was longitudinal studies over the last 100 years of GDP growth, over that sort of stuff. It didn't go to the end, basically. So the result was obviously was not good because of that sort of, it was idiotic error, human error. So solidness in terms of economics, and there's many of these stories. You could go on and go on. There's many of these things because economists are just humans, and they don't. Okay. I'm looking at my notes. Okay, the thing is that in the novel, I come back to the novel now. I'm switching in this thing. I'm coming back to the novel, and maybe also a little bit on my home turf, which is ecological economics. And I looked, and you spoke also about climate change. I think we all speak about climate change right now in these moments, and it's really good we do finally. So I looked also obviously at the novel and looking for stuff about environmental sort of issues. And there's one quite to the end of the book, I think there was one half sentence or something like that, which I found really interesting. That was you cannot. I think it was more or less that you cannot shop yourself away from climate change. Something like that, more or less. I don't have the quote, but it's more or less that. Obviously, the idea being that there is, and I think it's a little bit in contradiction to what you just said here, that we cannot find goods and a form of consumerism, which implies a form of production, obviously, which is going to bring us through climate change issues. That the whole way we do economies, so it's not a science anymore, but to do the activity, the economic activity, that is not going to bring us really into being able to tackle climate change. And there's a lot of reasons to that, and I want to take maybe 5 minutes about that. Probably most of it is very familiar to most of you, but whatever, I think it's important to me, so, and as you don't have the choice, it's me speaking. Okay. The idea behind ecological economics is that we want to define basically, well, now it has been watered down a little bit, but when he founded this thing, it was about founding a new science, something different. Not something which is attached to that disciplines and these faculties, these things, these pillars, but something new. Because there was a whole bunch of ecologists, so biologists, and the guy looking at the ecosystems, who in the 70s, late 70s, mid 70s, they got stuck because they tried to understand why ecosystems perished, and it was always, the main reason for that was always human activity, and in particular human economic activity. And on the other hand, same periods, mid 70s, you had a lot of economists, and they were looking at what actually is the substratum of economic activity, that resources thing. And they got a little bit upset about the fact that in classical 1970s, in classical economics, resources were not really spoken about. The last guy who spoke about resources, that was Marx. And that was by that almost 100 years ago. So there was a whole blank spot where hardly anybody spoke about resources, energy use, and all that sort of stuff. There was talk about pollution, since after the Second World War and that sort of stuff, but not about resources. So there's a common interest, on one hand, from economists, from a certain type of economists, and on the other hand, from biologists, if you want, ecologists, to look at these interactions. And they basically found ecological economics as a new scientific sort of endeavor, which is neither ecological nor economic, but something in between both, actually. With the idea that if you want to understand how society, dynamically reacts to stuff, which is what economists do, question of rarity, abundance, and that sort of stuff, you cannot do that if you do not understand how the ecosystems basically run. Because otherwise, the resources, you don't even get the idea of resources and about how things disappear and reappear in another sort of place and that sort of things. Sorry. So ecological economics is a new science, an interrelation sort of science. It was very funny. I think it was a good load of fun, and the people who speak of these times, they really speak of it as being something like a nice challenge, actually, to think this out, to think that there might be a way to found a new science which is not pillared, but it's something more horizontal and which tries really to understand interrelations. So that grew into principles of ecological economics, and there are 6 or 8 or 10 or whatever, but some of them are really obvious. The first one is infinite economic growth or economic activity is obviously impossible if you have a planet that is a globe and is finite. That's very obvious sort of stuff. Ignorance. If you're looking at ecosystems, we will never be able to understand really deeply how ecosystems work, simply because we are part of it. It's just impossible. So there's a big deal of ignorance and uncertainties attached to our knowledge, and attached to our knowledge of the understanding of the interrelationships between climate change and ecological sort of challenges and economic activity. The long term, if you look at ecosystems, it's the long term. And you said nobody can predict whatever, and in particular economists, they cannot predict whatever. The models we have, they don't predict anything, not even GDP growth, which is a very basic indicator. If you probably know how that works, in Belgium there's a institution who has the computer which runs the predictions on GDP. That's the Bureau Fédéral du Plan. There's a guy, presses the button 4 times a year, because there are these predictions. They come out 4 times a year with a leaflet. It's a 2-sided leaflet. It's quite well done, and it's like that since 40 years more or less. It's very traditional sort of. So four times a year, somebody pushes on the button of the computer, and blah blah blah, comes out. It's going to be 1.1% more GDP in the second quarter of 2019 or something like that. That is supposed to be run on the. Obviously, that's what we think. That they use the data in real time. They use the data till this morning, and then the guy pushes on the. But no, that's not what happens. In order to really calculate GDP, that we calculate it back basically, and so we're lagging behind. In Belgium, it's 18 months, and they are pretty good because it's a small economy. It's a non-complicated economy. In the bigger economies, it's more like 2 years or something like that. And they bring out 4 times a year these leaflets, and at the back page, they correct the projections. There's the real GDP, so to speak, and not even that real GDP is taken into account to do the future projections. And the future projections, they only run for a quarter, at the best for a year. If you're trying to understand what ecosystems and how they evolve, a year is irrelevant. You should not even get up from your bed in the morning if you can just do a year. It's just trivial. So that's the long term. Nature has an intrinsic value. It has been a little bit said in the introduction. There's something about values. That's true. I think we believe more, all of us in ecological economists, that the social and the economic and the cultural systems, they co-evolve. What we call a problem, like climate change, is co-evolution, And is it an economic problem? Yes, no, that's also co-evolving against the cultural sort of context. Our understanding of nature is also co-evolving. We had the ozone layer sort of problem a couple of years ago, and now we have something else, and then we will have something else in a couple of years again. The language we have to use is systemic. It's systems science, basically, applied systems science, which is not math, which is applied systems science. It's different. The expertise is necessarily transdisciplinary, so it has to include the people on the ground, because every time we have some sort of ignorance about stuff, about how things work, we have to look at people and on the ground. And then there's methodological pluralism. It's not all calculable in dollars or euros or that sort of stuff. And that would be more of these principles, but that gives a little bit of a flavor on where it goes and how non-radical it basically is, because this is stuff which to most of you probably sounds like, yeah, okay, if you speak of the environment, it should be long term. It's not big news. But in economics, it might well counter quite a lot of the everyday sort of business they do in their papers. Okay, I don't know how I am with time. Do you check that? Yeah, that's fine. Okay. There's something which also has been said about in the introduction. I'm looking on with my work on empirics about capture. The novel is very much about these walkaways, these people, and they sort of do stuff collectively together and are actually extremely innovative about that. In today's words, at least in Europe, if you work with the Commission and these sort of actors, you would say it's social innovation. There's a lot of social innovation going on on the ground with the walkways, and they try to imagine another world which is socio-technically very, very different. And there's a little bit also in terms of climate change and other environmental challenges. There's that idea also that we might be able to shuffle us out of the mud by that sort of things, by social innovation, by the fact that we can sort of stick together and do our carrots together, instead of go to the supermarket. It will be more difficult with computers, but there are prospects to be able to, sooner or later be able again to do computers relatively locally and that sort of things. It's a social innovation is innovation which is both technological, because today the world is technological, but it's also social. It's about doing it together, sharing it somehow, and maybe not having the market take the bigger share of it to a certain extent. I have my best colleague for the moment, or the guy I'm working with most for the moment. He comes from innovation studies, and he looks at how these dynamics, the collective common carrot growing sort of activities, and the entire alternativeness which is around that sort of thing, about the maker spaces and all that sort of things, how they're supposed to be really alternative. But at least in Belgium and in most of Europe, once you look at what happens actually on the ground with these sort of activities, these collectives, they are never very far away from the institutions. Often they are part of the institutions to a certain extent. Or it's the institutions who, gave them a little bit a kick, a start or something like that. Or it's the institutions who give them money from time to time. Which is a little bit counterintuitive to a certain extent. I have friends who run a alternative currency here in Brussels. On what they run that? On public subsidies. That doesn't work, no? It's a little bit bizarre. If you believe in alternative currencies, you cannot ask the minister for subsidy or probably you have to, because that's how the system still runs. And so you have this capture and transformation sort of dynamics, which are fundamentally very interesting. And they're getting even more interesting if you're starting to speak with the people who do these sort of things and try to make them think around how far or how close they are to the system they want to disruptively change. There is something about this in the literature, which is, that idea of niches and that idea of regimes and the sort of these niches, which are the alternatives on the ground. They are supposed to, sort of link to the regimes and make them change, alter a little bit, and in the end, make supermarkets go away. And have us take back again the economics of food stuff to a certain extent. But so there's a double thing to it to a certain extent. That is, on the one hand, or at least much of the institutions themselves, they believe that they can sort of foster these social innovations and give them a kickstart or help them, support them. Often they are not very intuitive or very imaginative about it, how to do it. They just give them money from time to time, which is not very good. But there's something about that, and then the activities who accept that sort of support or live with that or surf on this support and still try to call themselves very alternative to. No one in Brussels or in Belgium up to here, hardly anybody really thought about the fact that what of the current system you need to dismantle in order to make place for these new alternatives. And that's going to be much more interesting, or at least we find that to be much more interesting as a reflection, is that what do we have to take away from our current technological, energy, mobility, food, whatever sort of systems? What do we have to close down? Not which sectors do we have to recreate, or but what do we have to take away from the current world in order to make place, or for things to appear. And for me, that's a whole bunch of a whole hook where a lot of imagination still is needed. As what do we need to get rid of collectively? GMOs in Europe, we are more or less have a consensus that we should get rid of it. Nuclear energy, we have more or less a consensus, except in France, that we should get rid of it. And there's much more of these things we need to get rid of, actually, if you want to change the world, if we want to have it happening fast and in a disruptive sort of term. Okay, I close with a last sort of comment, but very quickly, because it's very much present also in the novel, I find, and it's very interesting. That's the idea of the commons, that there's something we need to share. And I think that the organizers, or most of the organizers, are very close to that idea of the commons also. And in environmental terms and in ecological economics sort of terms, if you speak of the commons, you speak immediately of Elinor Ostrom, which is somebody who sort of tried to not conceptualize these commons, but who was the first economist, and she was a plain economist, who was trying to understand empirically what happens if people work together around the governance of what she called a resource pool. And that is, as an economist, that is so what she did with her husband and with a whole bunch of students and doctors and postdocs and all that is truly revolutionary. or has been truly revolutionary. She's dead by now, but it was really, that is really something really different. Because it was since 100, 120, 130 years, the first person who started to look again at what happened on the ground. She went empirically down into case studies and looked at these resource pools and tried to understand how they were managed. There was hardly any formula or that sort of stuff. She just went there and looked at his case studies and sort of described what she saw. And by the end, she had tens of thousands of these cases, and she could start to try to identify patterns, you know, how these resource pools are governed. And that is, in terms of economics, that is something which has been, and which still is, very disruptive. If you have a person who looks really at case studies in a sociological sort of term, that is different. In the whole faculty of economics, there are not many people doing that. It starts to get a little bit fashionable. You saw maybe the group of economists who got that fake Nobel Prize this year around Esther Duflo. And I don't like at all how it worked because it's a little bit weird again. But it's also empirics. And there's a whole drive towards looking again at empirics and not plain equations and that sort of stuff. And I think that's a real revolution in economics. And it will bring a whole different sort of science, I think, to us. Because I see it with PhD students. The economic PhD students, suddenly they get an inscription at the sociology faculty to get to that methodological seminar to do case studies. And that's something I think they didn't do for the last 100 years or something like that. And I think it's going to be radically different in a couple of years, what happens. But I will stop here and we will have time to discuss, I hope.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Okay, so we have 4 people who have been listening and thinking and have some flashes of observation and contributions to make. So what I'm going to do, bearing in mind that we've now been all listening for a while, is just ask you to give us the ideas that immediately come to mind. I'm going to frame up a question for each of them, which means I'm defining the territory, and you may wish to redefine that territory away from my question. But just to see, what would you build? How would you build on this? How would you weave it, challenge it, provoke it? Braid these two versions, these two reflections together. I'm going to ask first Michel Bouwens, who I have watched from a distance for many, many years. I have a very good friend who's completely in love with Michel Bouwens, and I will reveal the name later. A question around commons. Let's start immediately from the end of your last observation around commons, and particularly Michel's work on peer-based commons. It's potentially a fantastic breakthrough. It's certainly revolutionary in terms of the way in which we think about the redistribution or the definition of the way wealth and value might be distributed. Why does it seem to be so difficult to pull itself forward into the present? And how do we do this in a way that works? Or shall you come? Okay. So here we begin to open up, and I don't know whether we can make the lights eventually create an audience around all of us, but let's open up to that.
Yes. Well, I mean, there are different reasons why, I'm really obsessed with the commons, but the main reason is really simple. If we look at history, there's only one institution which preserves resources. It's not the market, it's not the state. Both the market and the state have incentives to overuse the resources, and the state, because it's competing with other states. So, they always tend to actually, every civilization has collapsed until now. Not a single one has not collapsed. And every time a civilization has collapsed, the commons have come back. So if we look at today, we see the open source communities, we see sharing in a good and bad way, the so-called sharing economy. We see all kinds of mutualizations happen, which happened every time that a civilization reached an overuse stage. Just for the anecdote, when I founded the P2P Foundation about too long ago now, our book was a diamond age. which Alberto says has been superseded by Walkaway, which I really unfortunately haven't read yet. And actually I went to 3 bookstores in Brussels and couldn't get it in time. But so probably that will be our new holy book when we swear. But anyway, so I just want to tell a kind of a telling anecdote, because 2 of the things I read in the Diamond Age just happened in the last year. And so I was in Chiang Mai, where I lived most of my year, which is the global capital of neo-nomadic work. We have a Facebook group, Chiang Mai Digital Nomads, with 25,000 people. And so I went to one of the meetings. So it's one of the 4 crypto meetings we have every week. I don't think you have that in Brussels or in Southern California. And so here was, one of those crypto guys saying something that I found hard to believe. And he said, literally, the problem in Chiang Mai is that we cannot find anybody who wants to work for money anymore. And just to say that, there is already a huge economy that is working on different principles. Blockchain economies, which represented $800 billion, and then went down to 100 billion. I don't know where they are now. But anyway, it's a substantial amount of economic flow. And, these people have succeeded in keeping 40% of the income for work, which no Marxist has ever achieved. And they design open collaborative ecosystems. There's only one problem with them: they are extractive to the outside. But they are designed as collaborative ecosystems where people can come in and out and participate and go out of these economic systems. Those are very, very, interesting that this is already happening now. And there's a really good book about it that I recommend to Cory, which is maybe also to you, Tom. It's called, stupid title, Change Makers. But it's about the digital future of the industrious economy. And his basic thesis is very simple. Whenever the system is in crisis, what emerges are capital poor and labor intensive alternatives. And they use the commons to survive and thrive. And this happened in the European Middle Ages, when thousands of people had to leave the agriculture. And they went, to rebuild the cities in the 11th century, and they created guilds, which were kind of commons. And they created the ethical economies of the free medieval cities that lasted for maybe 200 years. And so this is a very similar period. And so I think one of the biggest impediments is really imagination. And so I'm really thankful that people like Cory can basically open up, our brains to Tina, right? What is it? There is no alternative. And we use tapas. There are plenty of alternatives. And I would slightly disagree with Tom, because I think we actually have lots of communities. Yes, they are connected to the state. They are connected to the market. But they are also already reorganizing food. They're reorganizing energy. They're doing habitat. They're doing mobility. And so I think we live in really interesting times where Walkaway might not be such a futuristic option, but actually a necessity. So maybe just ask you about what you think about it. I think there is a real pulsation in our economy between extractive systems and periods of regeneration, which have to use the commons. There's just, maybe I'm a fatalist in your mind, but I think this is something we can observe in the past, and therefore I think there's a pretty good chance it's part of our future.
Thank you. Okay, so let's pick up then on this idea of the digital future of industriousness. And I'm going to invite Rob van Kranenburg to say a few words on that digital future, the economic consequences of the Internet of Things. What might it mean? How might you build on that idea of taking the commons to a digital future?
Okay, well, first I want to say quickly.
I just want to say
Yeah.
something. I'm just frustrated and I'm tired to say that and to have the need to say that. But could we just hear like women or more diversity voice? Because we are not going to have a new paradigm of new system with that kind of situation. And it's painful for me say that. It's painful to just have, I don't know.
My female economist turned us down and declined to come. The first invitee was Mariana Mazzucato. She said no.
No, but
What am I doing?
we always have this conversation, but we know why. But still, I found this conversation really interesting, but I just want to leave because I'm tired to see that.
Well, I will. So we have Maya here, Maya Kuzmanovic from Foam, and so I will hand over my bit to Maya, and I'm sure that you can say whatever I want to say, much better.
Well, actually, I would like to hear from you, because I do share an interest in diversity, but I also am very tired of women standing up and saying that they are tired of men speaking. So please speak up.
Okay.
Can you?
I can.
Okay.
Please, you can come to the stage. I would ask only for a moment of respect for people who are, in fact, also contributing a piece of thought, to take respect for each other no matter what the gender. This is the one thing I would ask. So please come forward and build on what you have, what you want to bring. If you want to bring it right now, because I don't think that this is going to be a gendered conversation, even though that is the implication that you wish to bring.
Actually, I just wanted to make it clear. I'm not like a feminist who does that all the time. I'm just more linked to economics right now. But I'm just tired of the situation. So if you want me to make a bit of diversity, I can. But I didn't say that to because I have to say something. It's just I'm just no patient anymore.
Okay, that's
okay.
Do you have a point that do you have a comment that you want to make? That's the point.
That's. I think that's the fair. It's
Okay.
a point.
Okay, I can add something to make it clear. It's for me a new system, a new paradigm come to with listening to other voice, listening to other voice that who maybe are shy to speak, have difficulty to speak, because we always have this idea that we invite women and then they cannot come, but we have to try again. More like why they are not coming, why they are not writing books of economy, why we also not bring more sensible idea and social issue into economics, because I think it's really related to the subject. So I'm just aware to be already in this utopia when we are talking about that. I already want to be inside the book of a new economic system. I just don't want to just speak about it again, because then we are in a representative ideas of what it could be, and that's from the past, not from the future, or not from the present. Maybe you
I wanted to say thank you for saying that. I don't generally speak on all male stages for the reason that you're articulating. I think hearing from people and their lived experiences, we just heard, people's lived experience actually introduces empiricism into the process. It's not just a pro forma exercise. And I'm sympathetic, Alberto. I've organized events. It's hard when you have a pipeline dominated by people who look like me to find people who don't look like me, because that's what the pipeline's full of. But it's also self-perpetuating. It's tough, but I also think it's a fair challenge, and I also think it's hard to say that kind of thing in front of a crowd. Thank you for saying it. I think it needed to be said. I wish I'd had the courage to have said it an hour and a half ago. Thank you.
So,
Okay, as I continue. So my remark is actually about a book from the 70s written by a feminist author, Margaret Pierce. And she wrote a book, Women on the Edge of Time, review. And so that is actually one of the few utopian sort of novels that I know that is not dystopian science fiction. We set up a reading group about it, and we had the first reading in Antwerp. And I was reading it with Dries de Roek, who's an interaction designer, and we're all involved in Internet of Things and council types of things and ThingsCon situations. And we were both really taken aback, because what's portrayed in that novel is exactly the vision of how we would want to have it. And in my sort of words, there would be hardcore centralization of the infrastructure, which we basically need. It's kind of a Chinese situation that we have now, so the building blocks are there. Decentralization of all the services, and then data staying with people. So that's the story. That's a triangle for this Internet of Things type of situation which we're in, and which we're going to live together with 50 billion devices that are also developing kind of personas and avatars and and data bodies. So that's the first thing, sort of to ask everybody to go to Google Margaret Pierce, Women on the Edge of Time. There's about 80 still left on Amazon. I bought a few for like $8-9. Then Google, well, if you Google her, I think you already find the Internet of Things meetup that I run in Ghent. But would love to do a reading with Edgeryders in Brussels, so that we can continue this in the Sci-Fi lab and read together Margaret Pierce, because it's an absolutely amazing vision that she had in the 70s. So then the second thing, sort of quickly, I really was really taken aback with, really enjoyed Corey's presentation, I really did. And sort of also I was shocked a little bit by the second presentation, because I didn't know that economists were actually humans, so that was that was really news to me. And but I think sort of there's a book out by Hart and Negri, and it talks about temporary leaders. And I fully agree that because I was in the same boat for about 20 years talking to policymakers, having to scare them for an hour, then 15 minutes of scare, 10 minutes of solutions. Now it's actually quite reverse. So if I talk to them now, within a few minutes we can really agree on all the things, and we go into solutions. So, but basically, what needs to change is us. Is as you said, we need to move from fighting denial to fighting nihilism, which means that we have to change ourselves. And I really like this idea of Hart and Negri changing ourselves into temporary leaders, which is quite difficult because we're not used to being leaders or to lead. It's not something that we want. But I think the temporary is important. So this is where we can sort of step back and also move into more like the commons and have more like peer-to-peer type of relationships of leadership. Then, just very quickly, we were with a lot of people here, but we were in Turin last week with the Decode Festival, which is like a really good blockchain solution run by Dynork in Amsterdam. And Evgeny Morozov was there and lots of other people, and they also spoke about the Green Deal. And so from a European perspective, from my perspective, I get a little bit worried when I see too many Americans coming in and sort of offering me a Green New Deal. So I like it in a way because I think we need something like that, but I don't like the term deal, which to me is quite Trumpian. It's not something it's definitely something we can do about. So we need a new term. Green New Deal is not gonna do it, I think. So, but I do agree that we need to have some common landing page on something like that. But I hope it can be something different.
It's a Green Marshall Plan.
Which is what many are asking is that what the Green New Deal is all about? Exactly. Okay, we have a couple of other people who have been thinking about this and will add a build to it. But I think apropos of bringing in different voices, shall we take a couple of questions, comments, reflections from people sitting in the audience now, before we move on to any more reflections that are building on each other? Anyone with a thought they would like to put forward? Here?
So this is a question that's not really mine. It's a friend of mine that kind of pointed it out, but it really jumped out at me. Corey talked about how money is created. You know, all money is debt, is credit. And kind of it came in the same line there with Tom, was like, it's all about economics, but nobody's really talking about the monetary system, except maybe, you know, as an amateurish hobby for some people. But it's like, there's a layer of software underneath our economy. You know, money is not hardware, it is software. So why are we not talking about that?
Let's open that up to a reflection from anyone in addition to the stage.
Hello. I would like to ask about what do you think about the political consensus? It seems to me that we are an elite of people. We are all more or less agreeing on the same things, the same values. But then when we have elections, we have the right who is winning, the populists that are winning around in Europe. And I'm sorry, you have Trump in the United States. And so how can we deal with this problem? So like, it's okay. We are all agreeing on these topics, but we are too few. And how can we communicate to the voters, the people that are going to choose? And they have a lot of worries, and then other reasons to choose other parties that don't think like this.
Okay, so a question about money as software. How are we handling that? And the challenges of consensus.
I could take a stab if that's okay. I think there's a way to kind of fuse all of these, whether we should be pessimistic or optimistic about where our political consensus is, and also how we think about money. I guess this mic also doesn't work. We have an epidemic of failing mics. Talking about our political consensus and where it's moving, and also the way we think about money. I mean, I take your point that there isn't an economic orthodoxy in the sense that of the parity of rational actors, but there are some orthodox elements to our economics over the last 40 years, including a series of policies that have made our economics less pluralistic and more and our society more concentrated, both in terms of wealth and industry. So the downregulation of antitrust and anti-monopoly enforcement over 40 years that has led to a world where, like, the internet is 5 giant websites filled with screenshots from the other 4. The increase in wealth and also in intergenerational wealth transfers that are the results of, if not on a consensus among academic economists, a consensus among economists working for states about the optimal way to arrange our affairs and how taxation should work, and so the dismantling of inheritance taxes and the severe changes to progressive tax, and it's led to an increase in monopolization, and that has led to dysfunction in a lot of domains. And I think when you see the rise of populist parties, that in many ways they're a reaction to that for example, I think when you scratch the surface of an anti-vaxxer, for example, what you'll find is someone who is incredibly deep in their knowledge of the dysfunction of the pharmaceutical industry and pharmaceutical regulation. They'll say, well, look at the opioid crisis. You have regulators who are totally captured by a super concentrated industry, literally let them get away with murder and killed more Americans than the Vietnam War did, and got richer than the Rockefellers doing it. Why should we trust them on vaccines? That this breakdown in trust in institutions has a direct link to the increasing in concentration and therefore the increasing capture. That's the bad news. The good news is that there are people who care about this issue from a lot of different angles, right? There's people like me who wear glasses who are worried about the fact that a single Italian hedge fund-backed company, Luxottica, owns every single eyewear brand in the world, as well as the largest lens lab, as well as the largest eyewear insurer, as well as every major retailer for eyewear, all owned by one company that has raised prices 1,000% in 10 years through acquisition strategies that were legal prior to the neoliberal reforms to antitrust. Those people don't know it, but they're on the same side as pro wrestling fans who have watched the pro wrestling world go from 30 leagues 30 years ago to 1 league, whose billionaire owner has reclassified all of the wrestlers as contractors, taken away their medical insurance, they're dropping dead in their 50s and begging for money on GoFundMe. Those people have the same fight as people who are worried about the finance industry's concentration, who have the same fight as the people who are worried about the concentration in the tech industry, who have the same fight as the people who are worried about concentration in shipping and logistics, and so on and so on and so on. Now, there's a parallel to another moment in which people had a lot of different fights and they didn't know it. And they didn't know it was all the same fight. And that parallel is to the formation of the ecology movement in the 1970s. Prior to the coining and widespread use of the term ecology, people cared about whales or owls or the ozone layer or freshwater or saltwater, but they didn't know they all cared about the same issue because these were all different issues. Ecology fused all of these people into a movement, and now that movement is in the streets by the millions. We have a moment in which pluralism, anti-monopoly, anti-oligarchy could become that same mass movement, right? If we ask ourselves, how do we get in this climate change mess? Well, in part it's because there were so many excess rents from a highly concentrated energy sector that they could spend billions of dollars sowing doubt about the nature of climate change and its relationship to burning fossil fuels, and that they could still have billions more left over to give to their shareholders who would continue to vote for management, who would continue to sow that doubt, right? So oligarchy is in part how we get to this moment now, and anti-oligarchy is a cause with, by definition, very broad support, because almost no one is an oligarch. And so we're at that, as we pivot from denialism to nihilism and trying to head that off, that's our common cause that we all have. You may not care about climate change, but if you care about pro wrestlers, you're on the same side as me, right? So when we ask, well, why aren't we talking about money, and why isn't monetary policy in this? Well, because monetary policy is in large part dictated by increasing concentration of wealth in a small number of hands, and not by using the money as a utility to accomplish public functions. And again, that may not be the academic orthodoxy about the best way to use money, but it certainly is within state economics and within economic actors in the finance sector, their absolute consensus about how to do it.
Tom, anything you want to add about money?
Yeah, but maybe shortly, just I like that thing which you said about sharing the diagnosis with policy people. I co-organized a couple of years ago a thing at the level of the European institutions which tried to question with the guys which are behind the European institutions the role of growth, economic growth. And we were very surprised to be able to gather 600, 800 people around that question for 2 days with quite a lot of big shots, chief economists of here, DG thing, quite a lot of big names and people with quite some power. And I had the same impression as you. The diagnosis is actually shit. We have to run fast, it should to be disruptive, the economic system is shit, it doesn't deliver, there what gets interesting, or where I found that dialogue, where it gets really interesting, is that there is not much shared about the fact that it might be necessary to question growth in itself. And that links to that Green New Deal sort of American thing. I have the impression for once Europe is on the forefront of these sort of discussions, because I do think the alternative economists, they don't speak anymore about green growth or Green New Deals or that sort of stuff. They speak of taking the whole discussion out of economic thinking and of economic dynamics, of no growth, A growth, degrowth, stopping growth, and all that sort of stuff. And that links to your question about where's the money. The money is actually nowhere, because in the current European monetary system, the monetary thing is out of the institutions. It's a totally independent, loose institution. And the guys in Frankfurt, the way it was structured at the time, the economic monetary system, the euro system, is basically the German system. So with a high level of independency for the monetary institutions. And that's what we have currently. And so there is no real monetary policy at the European level for the moment.
More about the fact that it's based on credit, because if you're talking degrowth, how can you have degrowth if there's a credit-based money system? That just doesn't compute.
It does. If we're starting to run, but we start to run models, to understand what happens when we're on degrowth trajectories. And it does end up, not automatically, but it does end up. We don't have to give up social security systems or social protection or more or less free education in Europe or that sort of stuff. We are able to pay quite a lot of stuff, actually, but just shifting around.
Which is the person of money. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I would argue that it's not an all-male panel. Stand up. Thank you. I would argue that it's not an all-male panel. And just to ask you, Kirsten, if you, as the CEO of a pan-European entity that funds innovation in climate change, could you talk to us about what your experience is to answer that question around the political landscape? So you're in many of those conversations, talking daily with the European Commission. I would love to hear your perspective to pay homage to the comment that was made earlier. So we'd love to bring you into the conversation here, if you would do that.
I can certainly do that. I'm super curious about one piece that I was hoping to hear about just right now, but I'm happy to, actually I'm going to do that and then come back. Which is the one braiding in around the relationship between a governance model and the economic system. And I wanted to ask for a 2-minute reflection from Giuseppe Porcaro, who is there, thank you, on democracy, on the relationship between this conversation and the political model and a democratic system, and the extent to which we might need to reinvent that. And then I will come straight back to, because actually in the conversations that I'm in the heart of, these are conversations about the entire political system that underpins what we understand our relationships with to be with one another, and it's very tightly connected assumptions about economies.
Yes, indeed. Indeed, there is a clear relation between this conversation and the discussion around the future of democracy and the future of governance. And that was a little bit some sort of reflections I wanted to bring into the table. The intersection between the study of what can be the next models and the next evolution in democratic systems, but what can science fiction tells us about it, but also where the economics is intertwined with all this. I mainly had 3 points where I, more than actual full-fledged reflections, were more like paths for widening up this conversation, and on both sides of the spectrum, from the side of the science fiction writers and from the side of the actual social scientists or economists or whatever we want to call them nowadays. So the first one is about the actual technology, the technology that runs the, let's say, the hardware that runs the democracy nowadays. Evgeny Zamyatin in 1921, as a Russian science fiction writer, wrote something from the future, somehow looking at the model in which elections are run, or were supposed to run in the present, or in the present still today. Like he says something about how foolish the ancestors, the people of the past, were to actually run elections on a totally unaccounted model where results were not known beforehand. He was writing in a novel called We, which was some sort of Orwellian kind of pre-Orwellian kind of universe set in 1,000 years from where he was writing. So the issue of technology and how technology is changing the way we take the decisions or the procedural manner about what democracy means is a big issue. Is the algorithm going to automate democracy? Is democracy linked to somehow just the way we vote, or democracy is something about procedure, substance, about how we have a conversation and how do we form our opinions? So that's something that definitely is a big topic. The second topic is not just about the technology, but it's about the result. What is the result of democracy? The result of democracy is policies. So nowadays policies are more or less evidence-based and based on, again, there is a certain element of technology on this. And linking up with the discussion with the Internet of Things, there is this in a lot of Internet of Things discourse, especially in corporate discourse, there is something called a switch from service-based economy to outcome-based economy. So if we are in a mode of outcome-based economy, and we think back what policies are, which are basically delivering results in a world of scarcity, in that kind of world, we could imagine that actually the next product that is going to be on the market is going to be policies themselves. So are we going to be running in a situation where you want to say something about it, I'm sure. It's just the third things about scale, geographical scale, because governance and where the decisions are taken and the issue of democracy is super important. And we saw a lot of science fiction around scale and around geopolitics. I mean, it's a classic, in terms of Europe, since we've been speaking quite a lot about Europe, the European scale is something that is not have seen so much in science fiction. We have a few examples. Dave Hutchinson, for example, a British writer, wrote a trilogy called the Fragmented Europe Trilogy, where he imagines polities fragmenting up to the size of this building or the room of this theater. Question is, more broadly speaking, about to which scales decisions has to be taken. I mean, we spoke about climate change, we spoke about, the need about the multiple communities and so on. And a little bit of not just a provocation, but an interesting exercise would be if we would start to think about the principle of subsidiarity, which is somehow the cornerstone or the ideological cornerstone even of the European Union as a new kind of polity. If we would start to think about the principle of subsidiarity, changing his name because subsidiarity is not sexy at all, it's not nice. We should have a sexy name for that. But take it and take out the variable of the nation state, which is on the middle, and then let's try to see what could be imagined out of it. It could be both an interesting exercise of word building, but also something that could be grounded actual to reality of Europe's today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I follow up very quickly with that? Just very quickly. So this is very important because this is also, I think, the reason why we're here, because we need these new narratives and these new stories. So we're in a kind of moment where we're used to having kind of over-the-top players on mobility and Airbnb and Uber, but we're now in a fight for identity itself. So what we have now is a fight for identity. Who is going to be the first issuer or verifier of the first identity that is given to some person or some object? So we're now in a kind of a situation in which we have like a lot of self-sovereign identities that are sort of being talked about, very local stuff. But there's also the next level of thinking of identity is World Identity Network, WIN, or ID 2020, Microsoft, Accenture, IDEO. And they're trying to bank the unbanked, and sort of. But basically, the idea is that they are going to go for identity. The moment they go for identity, then we are in a fully new ball game. That means that we've taken over the top players down to the level of really determining what human means, what human beings mean in this world, in a full seamless kind of connectivity of Internet of Things, ambient intelligence kind of world. So that's why I think we're in this key moment where it's not just about the narrative, but it's also about identities that become plural, that become more fluid, and that need new sort of shells. And that's, I think, why this is a good moment to have this conversation.
Yeah, I would agree. There's a person right behind you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to actually try to weave something in common. I'm going to start first, Corey. Thank you so much for so gracefully bringing out the point of what our colleague was trying to say in terms of representation and empirical evidence and anecdote and storytelling. And that's what I want to be coming out of. I'm from Puerto Rico. After the Hurricane Maria hit at the end of 2017, I'm living in Berlin, but I started one of the larger databases of donation drop-off points in continental US, and then 2 weeks later I was on the ground. And for me, it's been very apparent that in the same way that we say that the future is just evenly unevenly distributed, the dystopia is already here. A lot of people are already experiencing it. I was in Puerto Rico, and then 3 weeks later, there were libertarian groups that were trying to convince the government to start special economic zones as an experiment of governance. I was with groups that were doing surveys in communities, and you had startups from Detroit whose business model was selling their data to developers to come into Puerto Rico. So we were already experiencing a lot of the, let's say, dystopian parts of some of the things that we're talking about. So I actually wanted to bring it to both of you. Tom, you in terms of trying to, let's say, come up with a better definition of what GDP and potentially thinking about a larger story, what when Mama Ursula K. Le Guin said, a realist of a larger reality. So I want to bring it to you, and I want to bring it to you to Corey, and obviously you, Kirsten, as you're talking to policymakers here in Europe, is what are the narratives? If we know that narratives, if we accept as lovers of sci-fi that narratives affect the frame by which we measure future policy or current policy as it's being implemented, instead of potentially focusing on, okay, what are the positives, where we should be learning, what are the dystopias what are the narratives that we know are currently being sold to us in different ways, and so we know what to steer clear of by perpetuating, etc. Thank you.
So I'm not going to let Corey or Tom respond to that. I'm going to capture it, and I'm going to acknowledge that there's a whole other set of questions and reflections from the virtual chat room that's engaging with this. But in the interests of our sanity and our stomachs, I'm going to suggest that we bring to a close this particular first exercise in exploration and laboratory thinking. This is a lab, so it's a pure experiment to see what happens if you play around with I would come from, I'm going to speak now immediately to what it's like to be on stage and being told that you're an all-male panel. And sitting there going, whoa, that was the first actual gendered power play I've heard in a few years. So here I am as an all-male panel representative, feeling already the interesting dynamics that you get when you put a couple of people on stage and you have some people in an audience, and straight away actually what you're playing with is power exchanges straight away, nothing to do with gender, simply just representation of authority and the voices around it. And I'm going to weave a couple of threads together to close us out, enable us to go and have a party, and to acknowledge that there are ongoing conversations to be had from this. This is a laboratory of thinking about how do we bring different ideas and different narratives and different ways of framing and making narratives arrive. So a couple of threads from what we've heard. Corey referred to activism as being an act of encouraging people that it is not too late to do something. Shift us from thinking about activism as something that's about knocking on the door saying there's a problem, to something which is an active act of engaging people in the possibility, that there is still a chance, that there is something we can do. I think that connects very strongly to the notion of what narratives are and what narratives are for. I want to bring into this something about the idea of the inherent generative dynamics of narratives. If you think about the way in which narratives feed a set of expectations, what it is that we expect to hear, expect to see, they can feed despair, they can feed hope. It entirely depends on how you design them and what you design them to have reference to. So that brings me to the beautiful expose of the manifold ironies of economics as a fundamentally imprecise, fuzzy logic human activity, cloaked and dressed as institutionalized science and mathematics, and constantly negotiating its own ironies on multiple fronts. And so what do we do with the value of irony? Because irony allows us to get distance. It allows us to get perspective on what it is that we're trying to do. What can we do in this laboratory experiment as we take it forward with bringing an ironic perspective onto economics? How does it open up play, humor, the role of the narrative itself? I'm a medieval historian occupying a role as a CEO of an organization using taxpayers' money to do something that is entirely dominated by scientists, technologists and engineers, perpetuating a notion of a technologically optimistic future. A series of solutions that are going to sort us all out by energy substitution, carbon capture, carbon reuse, and change agricultural practices. And constantly in my day job, the thing I negotiate almost permanently is the extreme irrationality of human meaning making and human decisions, and most importantly, the power, though, of meaning, the missed power of meaning. So I think about the conversations that I have with, say, the mayor of the city of Amsterdam, whose problem is not how are we going to solve for roofs that are too small to generate enough solar energy for the people who live in the houses below them, or a city that is dependent upon water and has major issues with waste and so on, or how does she change out the challenges in mobility, but how does she persuade the people living in that city that she's not taking away their cars, taking away meat, and making life more miserable? How does she shift the ground and the narrative and create ironic distance and perspective on what it means, fun-loving distance and perspective on what it means to live in a regenerative city or a regenerative society? And that's a material challenge. Economics and politics are at the heart of it, but the issue at stake is meaning and the sense of self and identity that comes with it. And that leads me to a reflection, just kind of connecting across a few of these things, which is, how do we bring together art and science in such a way that they start to reinforce each other's sense of the possibility of remaking things? Because we need a notion of meaning and the remaking of meaning to give ourselves spaces. And I'm going to particularly pick up on this question around how do we create space to let stuff go? What is it that we work out that we have to unlearn or abandon to create the space for new things or different things to come in? And it comes back a little bit to a question around what we are doing with the notion of the framing of policy. So let me finish with the Green Deal, because that's a thread in your presentation, a comment here. My daily problem, on Wednesday morning I need to go and meet with Timmermans' cabinet, and I need to give them the 10-minute soundbite on what should be in Europe's new Green Deal. And one of the things that I've been asking myself is, who is writing this deal and for whom? Because the actors in that play on this stage are all institutional actors, which means that they have no access to the forms of opening up access to non-institutional actors unless the first line of the Green Deal is to acknowledge the failure of nation states. And therefore the reason for reaching out to non-institutional actors, cities, citizens, communities, mothers, children, the next set of generations that we need, bloggers, hackers, co-owners, co-participants, co-makers. And that's probably the most intriguing question that Europe could bring to the notion of a deal. How do we hack the narratives around a deal that gets us to some form of economic and political participation that is not institutional? And how might we use experiments like this to help us come up with the narratives and the meaning and the framing of meaning as a relationship between identity and the context we're in to give us that possibility? My recommendation to Timmermans is going to be, you're going to have to turn this into a poem. Make it a poem that European citizens are writing together with one another, and maybe we get to do something extraordinary with one another. But we'll have to see whether he takes me up on that one. Okay, thank you very much. Please don't neglect to have a look at the website, to follow the blog, to engage in all of the other people whose thoughts and thinking were sitting out around this. And please take this as a first raw, experimental and bumpy exploration of what it means to start a dialogue around how one brings art and science together, imagination, meaning, narrative, and some of the more gritty questions of what goes on behind the scenes and that are carried in our assumptions and carried in our language. Thank you.